Please subscribe, like, and share. It really helps us out. And of course, if you have any questions, comment below and we will answer you as soon as we can. Welcome to this video in our series on A-level economics. Today we are looking at 1.2, how markets work. Topics covered today are as follows: rational decision-making, demand, price, income, and cross-elasticities of demand, supply, the elasticity of supply, price determination, price mechanism, consumer and producer surplus, indirect taxes and subsidies, alternative views of consumer behavior. If you haven't seen our previous videos, click on the card above.
Firstly, for today, rational decision-making. We need to look at the underlying assumptions of rational economic decision-making. 1. Consumers aim to maximize utility. Utility is the satisfaction gained from consuming a product. The rational consumer is called Homo economicus, who makes decisions by calculating the utility gained from each decision and chooses the one which will give them the most satisfaction. 2. Firms aim to maximize profit. Economic theory assumes that firms are run for their owners and shareholders and so aim to maximize profit in order to keep the shareholders happy. 3. Governments aim to maximize social welfare. Governments are voted in by the public and work for the public, so should aim to maximize their satisfaction by taking decisions that increase social welfare. This is the basis for economic thinking, but it is currently being questioned by behavioral economists. Economic agents do not always have the information necessary to act rationally, and consumers do not always make calculated decisions.
Next, let's talk about demand. Demand is the ability and willingness to buy a particular good at a given price and at a given moment in time. Now, let's look more closely at movements and shifts of the demand curve. 1. A movement along the demand curve, for example from A to B, is caused by a change in the price of the good. A shift of the demand curve, for example, D1 to D2, is caused by a change in any of the factors which affect demand, the conditions of demand. 2. A movement from A to B is a contraction in demand, T. The quantity demanded falls because of an increase in price. A movement from A to C is an extension in demand, the quantity demanded rises due to a decrease in price. Movements along the curve are not called increases or decreases, this only occurs when the curve shifts. 3. A shift from D1 to D2 is a decrease in demand because fewer goods are demanded at each and every price. For example, at price P, only Q2 goods are demanded rather than Q1 goods. A shift from D1 to D3 is an increase in demand, as more goods are demanded at each and every price. Now, Q3 goods are demanded at price P.
Let's look at the conditions of demand. The conditions of demand are the factors that cause the demand curve to shift. A shift to the right is an increase in demand and a shift to the left is a decrease in demand. One way to remember this is the mnemonic pirates. 1. Population. If the population rises, we would expect demand for all products to increase, and so the demand curve will shift to the right. This is because the more people there are in the country, the more people who will want a good. 2. Income. For most goods, if income increases, demand increases because a person can afford to buy more of the product. If there is a fall in income, then the demand would decrease and shift to the left. However, for some goods an increase in income can lead to a fall in demand and vice versa. This is a concept called income elasticity of demand. 3. Related goods. If goods are complements or substitutes of each other, then a change in the price of another good can cause a shift in the demand curve. Substitutes are where you either buy one good or the other. For example, you either buy a pair of Nike trainers or a pair of Adidas trainers. An increase in the price of Nike trainers would lead to a contraction in demand for Nike trainers and an increase in demand for Adidas trainers, as we would expect people to buy them instead. Complements are goods such as DVDs and DVD players, where if you have one, you need the other to go with it. If the price of DVD players drops, demand for DVD players would extend, and we would expect the demand curve for DVDs to increase. This is linked to the concept of cross-elasticity of demand. 4. Advertising. If a firm carries out a successful advertising campaign, demand is likely to increase. If a competitor firm carries out a successful advertising campaign, demand for the first firm will fall. A successful advertising campaign by Tesco will increase demand for Tesco but reduce demand for Asda. 5. Taste and fashion. If something becomes more fashionable, we expect demand to increase, and if it becomes less fashionable, then demand will fall. 6. Expectations. Expectations of what might happen in the future can have a big impact on the level of demand for some goods. If people expect a shortage of something, or that price will rise in the future, then demand for that product will increase. If people expect that prices will fall in the future, demand will decrease. 7. Seasons. Some products will find their demand affected by the weather. For example, hot summers cause an increase in demand for sun cream whilst wet summers cause an increase in demand for umbrellas. Government legislation can also have an effect on the demand for goods. Demand for car seats increased after the government made it a legal requirement that young children have to sit in them. Next, diminishing marginal utility. The demand curve slopes downward, showing the inverse relationship between price and quantity. This can be explained by the law of diminishing marginal utility. In order to explain or predict how people will spend their money, we have to assume that they are going to behave rationally, expecting them to spend it according to what gives them the greatest level of satisfaction or welfare. Total utility represents the satisfaction gained by a customer as a result of their overall consumption of a good. For example, the satisfaction of eating the whole bar of chocolate. Whilst marginal utility represents the change in satisfaction resulting from the consumption of the next unit of a good, in this case, the increased satisfaction by eating another bite of chocolate. The law of diminishing marginal utility states that the satisfaction derived from the consumption of an additional unit of a good will decrease as more of a good is consumed, assuming the consumption of all other goods remains constant. This explains why the demand curve slopes downwards. If more of a good is consumed, there is less satisfaction derived from the good. This means that consumers are less willing to pay high prices at high quantities since they are gaining less satisfaction.
That brings us to price, income, and cross-elasticities of demand. The elasticity of demand is an attempt to measure the responsiveness of quantity demanded to changes in other variables, such as its own price, the price of other goods, and real income. If a good is elastic, it is relatively responsive, and if it is inelastic, it is relatively unresponsive. Firstly, what is price elasticity of demand, PED? This is the responsiveness of demand to a change in the price of the good. This is the percent change in quantity demanded divided by percent change in price. For example, if the original price was £5 and 100 were sold and the new price is £3 and 120 are sold, what is the PED? To calculate, the percent change in quantity demanded would be 120 minus 100, which would be 20. 20 divided by 100 gives us 0.2. We multiply this by 100 to give 20%. The percent change in price would be 3 minus 5, that gives us minus 2. Minus 2 divided by 5 gives us minus 0.4. Multiply this by 100 gives us minus 40%. PED equals 20% divided by minus 40%. This gives us minus 0.5. So what do the numerical values mean? Most values of PED are negative, since a rise in price leads to a fall in output. Therefore, we look at the integer alone, disregarding the negative sign. Unitary elastic PED is where PED equals 1. This is where the quantity demanded changes by exactly the same percentage as price. This would be shown as a reciprocal curve. Relatively elastic PED is where PED is greater than 1. Quantity demanded changes by a larger percentage than price, so demand is relatively responsive to price. The curve will have a gentle slope. This means a small change in price will lead to a large change in quantity demanded. Relatively inelastic PED is where PED is less than 1. Quantity demanded changes by a smaller percentage than price, so demand is relatively unresponsive to price. The curve will be steep. This means large changes in price lead to small changes in quantity demanded. Perfectly elastic PED is where PED equals infinity. A change in price means that quantity falls to zero and demand is very responsive to price. This would be shown by a horizontal line. perfectly inelastic PED is where PED equals 0. A change in price has no effect on output, so demand is completely unresponsive to price. This would be shown by a vertical line. What are the factors influencing PED? 1. Availability of substitutes. If a product has lots of substitutes, for example, instead of buying Coke you could buy Pepsi, people will switch to other products when prices go up. Therefore, PED will be elastic. If there are no substitutes, then the demand curve will be inelastic, since even if prices go up, people will have to buy that good if they want it, as there are no alternatives. 2. Time. The longer the time, the easier it will be for a person to find an alternative product or supplier of the product, so the more elastic the good is. In the short term, many goods are inelastic as people may not even notice the price difference. 3. Necessity. If you need something, the demand curve will be inelastic, because even if the price goes up, you still need to buy it. 4. How large of a percent of total expenditure? If a good or service represents a very small percentage of a person's expenditure, a significant increase in price will have a relatively small impact on how much they buy of that product, so it will be inelastic. For example, matches. 5. Addictive. If a product is addictive, then the demand curve will be inelastic. No matter how high prices are, people will still buy the goods to fulfill their addiction.
What is the significance of PED? The price elasticity of demand, along with the price elasticity of supply, determines the effects of the imposition of indirect taxes and subsidies. The more elastic the demand curve, the lower the incidence of tax on the consumer. This means that when PED is elastic, a tax will only lead to a small increase in price, and the supplier will have to cover the majority of the cost of the tax. When demand is inelastic, the tax will be mainly passed on to the consumer. Since consumers are relatively unresponsive to the price of this good, the quantity demanded will not fall by a large amount. This means that the tax will be ineffective at reducing output. However, it also means that there is higher tax revenue for the government. The more inelastic the demand curve, the higher the tax revenue for the government. These effects can be seen in the following diagrams. This diagram shows inelastic demand, as the demand curve is steep. The tax leads to a small fall in output but a large increase in price, with a large consumer burden. This diagram shows elastic demand, as the demand curve is sloping. Output falls significantly and the producer burden is high. These diagrams also show that revenue generated is higher when demand is inelastic. With a subsidy, elastic demand means that the consumer sees a small fall in price whilst the producer gains a lot in extra revenue. The more inelastic demand, the more the price falls. Elastic demand also means there is a large change in output following a subsidy, whilst inelastic demand means that there is little change in output. Therefore, subsidies on goods with inelastic demand are ineffective at increasing output. They are cheaper for the government to impose since output increases by less, and so the government has to pay the subsidy on fewer goods. These effects can also be seen in these diagrams. In this diagram, demand is inelastic and there is a small rise in output but a large fall in price, with little producer gain. In this diagram, demand is elastic and there is a large rise in output but a small fall in price. These diagrams show that the government has to spend more on subsidies on elastic goods. The shift from S1 to S2 on tax diagrams is a result of the imposition of an indirect tax. This raises the cost of production and shifts supply to the left. The opposite occurs with a subsidy. Diagrammatic analysis of indirect taxation and subsidies is looked at in more detail at the end of this unit.
Now we need to look at PED and revenue. Firstly, for an elastic demand curve, a decrease in price leads to an increase in revenue and an increase in price leads to a decrease in revenue. Next, for an inelastic demand curve, a decrease in price leads to a decrease in revenue and an increase in price leads to an increase in revenue. Finally, for a unitary elastic curve, a change in price does not affect total revenue. Let's go through an example. For a product, its PED equals minus 0.5. The firm currently sells 10,000 at a price of £5. What will happen to total revenue if the price falls to £4? We can start by calculating the original total revenue. This is 10,000 multiplied by £5. This gives us £50,000. Next, let's calculate the percent change in price. This is £4 minus £5, giving us minus 1. Multiplying this by 100 gives us the percentage. This gives us minus 20%. Now we need to find the change in the output. The PED formula would be minus 0.5 equals the percentage change in quantity divided by minus 20%. By rearranging the PED formula, we would get minus 0.5 multiplied by minus 20%. This will give us a change in the quantity sold of 10%. To get the new output, we need to add 10% to the output, or in this case 1,000. This gives us a new output of 11,000. Our new total revenue will be 11,000 multiplied by £4. This gives us £44,000. The difference in revenue will be our new revenue minus our old revenue. This will be minus £6,000. So, in this case, revenue will fall by £6,000.
That brings us to income elasticity of demand, or YED. This is the responsiveness of demand to a change in income. What do the numerical values mean? 1. An inferior good is when YED is less than 0. A rise in income will lead to a fall in demand for the good. For example, Tesco value goods are inferior goods. 2. A normal good is when YED is greater than 0. A rise in income will lead to a rise in demand for the good. 3. A luxury good is a type of normal good when YED is greater than 1. 4. Goods can also be elastic or inelastic in income. If the integer is bigger than 1, the good is elastic. If the integer is smaller than 1, the good is inelastic, and these tend to be necessities. What is the significance of YED? It is important for businesses to know how their sales will be affected by changes in the income of the population. If the economy is improving and people's incomes are rising, it is vital that a business knows whether this is likely to increase their sales or not. It may have an impact on the type of goods that a firm produces. During times of prosperity, firms might produce more luxury goods and less inferior goods.
Now, cross-elasticity of demand, or XED. This is the responsiveness of demand for one product to the change in the price of another product. So, what do the numerical values mean? 1. Substitutes are where XED is greater than 0. An increase in the price of good B will increase demand for good A. For example, Coca-Cola and Pepsi are substitutes. 2. Complementary goods are where XED is less than 0. An increase in the price of good B will decrease demand for good A. One example is DVDs and DVD players. 3. Unrelated goods are where XED is equal. A change in the price of good B has no impact on good A. The size of the integer represents the strength of the relationship. The larger the number, the stronger the relationship between the two. What is the significance of XED? Firms need to be aware of their competition and those producing complementary goods. They need to know how price changes by other firms will impact them so they can take appropriate action.
Now we finally get to talk about supply. Supply is the ability and the willingness to provide a good or service at a particular price at a given moment in time. Let's look at the movements and shifts of the supply curve. A movement along the supply curve, for example from A to B, is caused by a change in the price of the good. A shift of the supply curve, for example, S1 to S2, is caused by a change in any of the factors which affect supply, the conditions of supply. A movement from A to B is a contraction in supply. The quantity supplied falls because of a decrease in price. A movement from A to C is an extension in supply. The quantity supplied rises due to an increase in price. Movements along the curve are not called increases or decreases. This only occurs when the curve shifts. A shift from S1 to S2 is a decrease in supply because fewer goods are supplied at each and every price. For example, at price P only Q2 goods are supplied rather than Q1 goods. A shift from S1 to S3 is an increase in supply, as more goods are supplied at each and every price. Now, Q3 goods are supplied at price P.
Let's have a closer look at the conditions of supply. 1. Costs of production. If a business has an increase in their costs but their selling price stays the same, they will make less money on what they sell. They will put up their prices in order to avoid making a loss, and so less is supplied at each price, meaning the supply curve will shift to the left. If they have a decrease in their costs, then it will shift to the right. 2. Price of other goods. Joint supply is where the production of one good automatically causes the production of other goods. For example, the production of beef automatically produces leather. Therefore, if the price of beef rises, farmers will slaughter their cows and so will get more leather, causing a shift to the right and an increase in supply. Competitive supply is where the production of one good prevents the supply of another. For example, if the farmer kills his cows, he can no longer produce the milk. Therefore, the rise in the price of beef may cause a decrease in the supply of milk and a shift to the left. 3. Weather. For some goods, particularly agricultural goods, the supply is dependent on weather. For example, if the weather is good, more wheat will be produced, so the curve will shift to the right. If the weather is bad, the producers won't be able to supply as much wheat, and so it will shift to the left. 4. Technology. If new technology is introduced, then it will lead to a fall in production costs as there is higher productive efficiency. This will encourage firms to lower prices or produce more goods for the same price, and so the curve will shift to the right. During war or natural disasters, companies may have to use less efficient technology, so the supply curve will shift to the left as they produce less at each price. 5. Goals of the supplier. If a supplier is motivated by helping society and providing a service, they may increase supply even when that doesn't provide extra profit. 6. Government legislation. If the government passes laws that mean more cars have to have catalytic converters, the supply of cars with catalytic converters will increase. High levels of regulation may increase costs and so decrease supply. 7. Taxes and subsidies. A tax decreases supply, and a subsidy increases supply by affecting the costs of production. 8. Producer cartels. Some firms or countries come together in order to decrease supply and therefore increase the price of their good to increase profit.
Next, elasticity of supply. Firstly, and curiously lastly, price elasticity of supply, or PES. This is the responsiveness of supply to a change in the price of the good. So, what do the numerical values mean? Unitary elastic PES is where PES equals 1. This is where the quantity supplied changes by exactly the same percentage as the price. This would be shown as a curve that starts in the origin, is steeper than an elastic curve but more sloping than an inelastic curve. Relatively elastic PES is where PES is greater than 1. This is where the quantity supplied changes by a larger percentage than price, so supply is relatively responsive to price. The curve will be more sloping, starting on the price axis. Relatively inelastic PES is where PES is less than 1. This is where the quantity supplied changes by a smaller percentage than price, so supply is relatively unresponsive to price. The curve will be steep, starting on the quantity line axis. Perfectly elastic PES is where PES is infinity. This is where a change in prices means that the quantity supplied falls to zero and supply is very responsive to price. This would be shown by a horizontal line. Perfectly inelastic PES is where PES equals 0. This is where a change in price has no effect on output, so demand is completely unresponsive to price. This would be shown by a vertical line.
What are the factors affecting PES? 1. Time. This will have an impact on the amount of a good that can be supplied at any price. In the immediate term, no matter how high the price is, a supplier can only sell the amount of product they have, so the supply is perfectly inelastic. In economics, the short term is the period of time when at least one factor of production is fixed, and the long term is when all factors of production are variable. In the short term, they could sell more products but will still be restricted by the factors of production, meaning it will still be relatively inelastic. In the long term, they can increase production and all factors are variable, and therefore the supply curve will be elastic. The longer the period of time the supplier has to make a change and increase production, the more elastic the curve will be. 2. Stocks. If a business has a stockpile of goods when the price goes up, they will simply decide to use up some or all of their stockpiles, and therefore supply will be more elastic. 3. Working below full capacity. If a business is working below full capacity, for example, they are producing 50 goods but could produce 100, and there's an increase in price, they can easily respond by producing to their full capacity, so the supply curve will be more elastic. 4. Availability of factors of production. For example, labor may need particular skills or training, so cannot be instantly increased. If the wages of a doctor rise by a large amount, it would still take years before there would be an increase in the number of doctors, so it is inelastic. 5. Ease of entry into the market. Large costs of startup equipment could make it difficult to increase supply, which makes it inelastic. Trade unions or professional associations can restrict entry. 6. Availability of substitutes. If a good has a lot of producer substitutes, it will have high elasticity. One model of car is a substitute for another model of car. Producers can easily switch between the two, meaning suppliers can alter the pattern of production if price rises or falls, so supply can change.
So, how is price determined? The equilibrium point refers to the point at which there are no more forces bringing about change. Price equilibrium is where supply is equal to demand, so where the demand and supply curves cross. This price is also known as the market clearing price because all products supplied to the market are cleared or bought, but no buyers are unable to buy the good. If the price was higher, there would be unsold goods, and if the price was lower, there would be consumers who would want to buy the good but would be unable to do so. In this example, the market clearing price is P1 with a quantity of Q1. What happens if you have excess demand? If the price is set below equilibrium, then there is excess demand. At the price P2, suppliers are willing to supply QS but consumers demand QD, meaning there is excess demand of the orange shaded area. As a result, there is a shortage in the market. Firms know they can charge higher prices and still sell their goods, so this will cause an extension in supply and they will now charge P1 for quantity Q1. This higher price will lead to a contraction in demand. The prices are now in equilibrium. How about excess supply? If the price is set higher than the equilibrium, then there is excess supply. At price P2, suppliers are willing to supply QS but consumers only demand QD, meaning there is an excess supply of the orange shaded area. Prices would have to fall. As a result, firms have unsold goods. This will encourage them to put on sales to sell the excess goods, causing prices to fall and supply to contract to P1. As a result, demand will extend to P1. The market will now be in equilibrium.
Now let's look at shifts in demand and supply. An increase in demand from D1 to D2 will lead to an increase in price from P1 to P2 and an increase in output from Q1 to Q2. A decrease in demand would decrease the price and output. An increase in supply from S1 to S2 will increase output from Q1 to Q2 and decrease price from P1 to P2. A decrease in supply would increase the price and decrease output.
Now, let's look at the price mechanism. In a free market economy, the price mechanism allocates resources. Price is determined by the interactions of demand and supply, which also determines how much is bought and sold and by whom. Prices rise when buyers want to purchase more than suppliers want to sell, encouraging suppliers to sell more as they will be able to make a higher profit. Adam Smith described the invisible hand of the market, how the price mechanism is able to set prices. Firstly, the rationing function. The price system is a way of rationing goods because when the price increases, some people will no longer be able to afford to buy the product and others may no longer have the desire to buy the good. The limited resources can be rationed and allocated to the people who are able to afford them and those who value them most highly. Secondly, the signaling function. The price mechanism acts as a signal where resources should be used. When prices rise, producers move resources into the manufacture of that product. The change in price indicates to suppliers and consumers that market conditions have changed, so they should change the quantity bought and sold. When price equilibrium moves, output equilibrium moves with it. Lastly, the incentive function. It acts as an incentive for people to work hard. Buyers realize that the more money they have, they are able to buy more products. Suppliers realize that if they produce more of the goods, they will make more money. Also, low prices act as an incentive for consumers to buy more of a good, and high prices act as an incentive to suppliers to sell more of a good. The price mechanism encourages people to behave a certain way.
Let's look at the price mechanism in the context of different types of markets, including local, national, and global markets. Firstly, local. The coronavirus pandemic has disrupted supply chains across the planet, and many countries have blocked imports to prevent the spread of the virus. If we take the example of British supermarkets, fewer imports from other countries mean there are fewer goods on supermarket shelves. As the demand for food is high but the supply is low, the price of food rises to ration off the excess demand so that only the consumers who value the food most highly buy them. This is an example of the rationing function. Secondly, national. The price of housing differs across the UK, from being high in the south and low in the north. There are multiple reasons to explain these discrepancies. London, not only the capital, is the second largest financial centre in the world, as well as home to many tourist attractions. As the population of London is high relative to the rest of the UK, house prices will rise through the rationing function, for example, to ration off excess demand and only provide houses to those who value them the most. The high house prices in London also offer an incentive for firms to allocate resources to the production of more houses, as there is profit to be made in this industry. This is an example of the incentive function. Thirdly, global. In 1973, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, also called OPEC, proclaimed an oil embargo to restrict the supply of oil on an insurmountable scale, due to geopolitical factors regarding America and the Middle East. This sent the price of oil at record-breaking levels across the planet, as oil was an invaluable resource to countries. This perfectly exemplifies the rationing function because the disequilibrium of supply and demand meant the high prices deterred consumers who didn't value oil highly, which left the market open only to those consumers who did. By raising the price of oil, the market once again returned to a state of equilibrium.
Next, consumer and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is the difference between the price the consumer is willing to pay and the price they actually pay, set by the price mechanism. This is illustrated by the orange triangle in the diagram. The demand curve shows the price consumers are willing to pay, and so the difference between the demand curve and the price shows the consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the difference between the price the supplier is willing to produce their product at and the price they actually produce at, set by the price mechanism. This is illustrated by the purple triangle in the diagram. The supply curve shows the price suppliers are willing to sell the good for, and so the difference between the supply curve and the price shows the consumer surplus. Consumer and producer surpluses show the economic gain from the buying and selling of the good. Consumer surplus shows the welfare gained by consumers for buying the good. The total satisfaction consumers receive from buying the good is the total area under the demand curve. They spend this area to gain this satisfaction. Therefore, their net gain is the orange triangle, the consumer surplus. Similarly, producer surplus shows the economic gain for producers by selling the good. Perfectly elastic demand will mean that there is no consumer surplus, whilst perfectly inelastic demand will mean that consumer surplus is infinite. The more inelastic demand, the higher the consumer surplus is likely to be. When supply is perfectly elastic, producer surplus is zero, and when it is perfectly inelastic, producer surplus is infinite. The more inelastic supply, the higher the producer surplus is likely to be.
Now it is time for shifts of demand and supply. A decrease in demand from D1 to D2 will lead to a fall in consumer and producer surplus, as both price and output decrease. Consumer surplus falls from ABP1 to CDP2 and producer surplus falls from P1B0 to P2D0. An increase in demand would have the opposite effect and increase consumer and producer surplus. A decrease in supply from S1 to S2 will lead to a fall in consumer and producer surplus. Consumer surplus falls from ABP1 to CDP2 and producer surplus falls from P1B0 to P2D0. An increase in supply would have the opposite effect and increase consumer and producer surplus.
Now, let's look at indirect taxes and subsidies. Firstly, indirect taxes. An indirect tax is a tax on expenditure where the person who is ultimately charged the tax is not the person responsible for paying the sum to the government. The business is required to pay the tax, but the customer is charged instead. There are two types of indirect tax. 1. Ad valorem tax is where the tax payable increases in proportion to the value of the good. The tax is a percentage of the cost of the good, for example, VAT. 2. Specific tax is where an amount is added to the price. The tax increases with the amount bought rather than the value of goods. For example, excise duties on alcohol, tobacco, and petrol are a specific amount, for example, 10 cents a liter. What are the impacts of a tax? The diagram shows a specific tax. The introduction of the tax causes supply to shift from S1 to S2 because it leads to an increase in the cost of production. This leads to a rise in price from P1 to P2 and a fall in output from Q1 to Q2. The consumer sees higher prices and suffers from a tax burden of the orange area. The producer sees a rise in costs and a fall in output, suffering from the tax burden of the gray area. The government gains tax revenue from the shaded areas. The size of the tax is the vertical distance between S1 and S2, shown by the line AB. The revenue the government raises will be equal to AB multiplied by Q2. This diagram shows an ad valorem tax. The effects are the same, but the supply curve shifts and tilts, so that the gap between S1 and S2 grows. This is because the tax is a percentage of the value. When the price is small, the tax will only be a small amount, but when the price is high, the tax will be a large amount. The vertical distance between the curve represents the size of the tax, and so the distance grows since the tax grows. This table shows the effect of a £2 tax being imposed. The initial equilibrium price was £5. With the new tax, when the business charges £5 for their product, they only get £3 as £2 is passed on to the government. As a result, if they are charging £5 with the tax, they are only willing to supply the same amount they were willing to if the price was £3 without the tax. The quantity supplied moves up 2 boxes in the table, and the equilibrium price is now £6, where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied after tax. This means that the incidence on the consumer is only £1 of the tax, and the supplier is also only paying £1. Let's look at the incidence of tax. The incidence of tax is the tax burden on the taxpayer. If the demand curve PED is perfectly elastic, or the supply curve PES is perfectly inelastic, the supplier will pay all of the tax. If the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, or the supply curve is perfectly elastic, all the tax will be passed on to the consumer. In general, the more elastic the demand curve, or the more inelastic the supply curve, the lower the incidence of tax on the consumer, meaning the supplier has to pay more. This means that all other things being equal, the more inelastic the demand curve, the higher the revenue of tax for the government because quantity demanded falls less, and the more goods that are bought, the higher the tax revenue. Now let's look at subsidies. A subsidy is a grant given by the government and is the opposite of a tax. It is an extra payment to encourage production or consumption of a good or service. They could be given to necessities, for example, bread, companies employing disadvantaged workers, or those manufacturing in the UK to keep them competitive with imported goods. The diagram shows an increase in supply from S1 to S2, since the producer sees a fall in production costs due to the subsidy. As a result, there is a rise in output from Q1 to Q2 and a fall in price from P1 to P2. The consumer subsidy is the orange box and the producer subsidy is the gray box. The total shaded area represents government spending. This is equal to the size of the subsidy AB times the new output Q2.
Finally, let's look at alternative views of consumer behavior. The underlying assumptions for all rational decision-making are that customers aim to maximize utility, companies aim to maximize profit, and governments aim to maximize the welfare of citizens. However, people do not always behave rationally, and this occurs for 3 main reasons. 1. Influences of other people. Rationality assumes people act individually to maximize their own benefits, but sometimes individuals are influenced by social norms, known as a bias. For example, someone may buy something to fit in or because everyone else has it, and so they are expected to buy it as well. Consumers become unwilling to change the bias, even if doing so will benefit them if it goes against the norms of society. Herding behavior occurs when an individual copies the actions of a large group. One example is the stock market, and this causes huge market bubbles. 2. Influence of habitual behavior. Most people have habits, and these habits reduce the amount of time it takes to do something because consumers no longer have to consciously think about their actions. Habits create a barrier to decision making since they limit or prevent consumers from considering an alternative. Habitual behavior includes addictions, and so this influences people's decisions. For example, consumers will buy more drugs and alcohol even though they know they should give up. Another habit many consumers have is buying their products at eye level. So supermarkets tend to keep higher priced products near the top, and lower priced products lower on the shelves. 3. Consumer weakness at computation. Many consumers aren't willing or able to make comparisons between prices, and so they will buy more expensive goods than needed. For example, many customers buy multi-pack goods because they assume they are cheaper, but this is not always the case. Also, consumers are sometimes poor at self-control and so do things they know they shouldn't. Similarly, consumers will make decisions without looking at the long-term effects, and so make irrational decisions. One example of this is consumers saving up for their pensions. Many put off doing this because they fail to look long-term. Thank you for watching our video. Please like, subscribe and share. And comment below so we can clarify things for you.